investigators who stumbled their way through the mystery in the late 1940s and early 50s, there were some fascinating characters. Imagine being able to meet and discuss flying saucers with the likes of Donald E. Kehoe, Edward J. Ruppelt, Frank Scully, Albert Bender, or Gray Barker. A young man who did was James Moseley, who had more than a passing interest in the subject. With no prior writing experience or credentials, he convinced the most prominent people in the field to sit with him for interviews for a book he'd set out to write. He never published the book, but found a place for himself in the world of flying saucers and sorcerers, where he'd remain for the rest of his life. In 1950, James Moseley was a young man with a trust fund who had just quit Princeton University. He had enough money that he didn't have to do anything productive, but he quickly became bored with, quote, recreational drinking, end quote, and skirt chasing. According to him in his 2002 autobiography, shockingly close to the truth, Confessions of a Grave-Robbing Ufologist, he sought a more satisfying way to fill his days and decided on travel and exploration. He got in contact with a well-known Italian explorer, Attilio Gatti, and paid to tag along with him to Africa. After his return, he approached an American explorer, Ken Crepine. Crepine was a regular contributor to Argosy magazine and lectured on his travels as well. Moseley lived in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and when Crepine came to New York City in 1953, Moseley was able to meet with him. Crepine quickly realized that he'd found a good thing in Moseley and made use of him as a chauffeur and a source of funds. After becoming aware that he was being used, Moseley made Crepine sign an agreement. It stated that when it came time to go on his expedition, in this case Peru, Moseley's way was paid in full. While they were waiting, the idea of collaborating on a book about flying saucers came up. Moseley recalled that the idea of a book had originally been Crepine's, and the idea that it be about flying saucers was likely his. He'd had an interest in the subject since 1948, after hearing about Thomas Mantell's, link available in the written version of this blog, tragic experience from a boy across the street. He quickly became fascinated and read the books being written about this new and evolving mystery as they came out. He read books by Donald Kehoe, Frank Scully, and George Adamski. Those three promoted the idea that flying saucers were from outer space. An essay that he wrote during this period indicates that while he was open to the idea that we were being visited by creatures from other planets, he was not a converted believer. The agreement was that Moseley would do the research and Crepine would write the book. Moseley went through his library and wrote the information about the cases he found most interesting on index cards. He then arranged them geographically and made plans to travel across the country and interview the witnesses. Then it occurred to him that he should find out more about the personalities that were becoming known in the field. These included writers, researchers, and members of the many flying saucer clubs that were being newly organized all around the country. Moseley recalled an article he'd clipped out and stuck in a scrapbook, which was a habit of his. He remembered that it had concerned an event in 1952 and found it in the book from that year. In June of that year, a man in Jersey City, August C. Roberts, had taken a picture of a saucer while on Skywatch duty as a member of the Ground Observer Corps. Moseley got in touch with Roberts, and Roberts suggested they meet at the home of his friend, Dominic Lucchesi. Both men, it turned out, were members of the very first flying saucer organization, the International Flying Saucer Bureau, started by Bridgeport, Connecticut resident Albert K. Bender. Moseley was off to a fine start. He'd managed to stumble upon two key IFSB members just as Bender was shutting down the Bureau. According to Bender, he'd been threatened by three mysterious men in black suits and told to cease his investigation. This would be the subject of the classic 1956 book by Gray Barker, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. Barker had been IFSB's chief investigator and would later become a good friend of Moseley's. Roberts and Lucchesi gave Moseley contact information for some of the prominent saucers of the day and talked about some of the theories concerning the origin and purpose of the saucers. They also recommended that he read the books of Charles Fort, who wrote about unexplained phenomena in the early 20th century. Moseley took notes and was becoming well prepared for his cross-country journey. Before he left, however, he decided to look into some local incidents and that he should meet with Bender. Moseley contacted people in the area who had reported sightings and interviewed them. He was particularly impressed with Associated Press reporter Paul Prett, who'd reported seeing a fast-moving orange-red disc near his New Jersey home. After a week of this, Moseley moved beyond being a chronicler and participated in an actual investigation. On October 20th in New Haven, Connecticut, a fiery object crashed through a 20-gauge metal sign and continued on. Left behind was trace evidence in the form of a jagged hole and embedded metal fragments. Roberts had been up there previously and invited Moseley to come along and help him continue his investigation. They interviewed witnesses and talked to a local investigator, Joseph Barbieri. Barbieri had taken the damaged section of the sign, removed some of the embedded fragments, and sent them to the newly formed Aerial Phenomena Research Organization to have them analyzed. APRO's founder, Coral Lorenzen, sent the fragments to a Milwaukee lab and they were identified as copper. Roberts and Moseley acquired fragments from the sign's wood support. The results of the analysis Roberts arranged also identified the fragments as copper, with the additional detail that it was high grade. On their way to Connecticut, Roberts had told Moseley more about Bender, and Moseley determined to drive to Bridgeport later and talk to Bender himself. With his, quote, way prepared, end quote, by Roberts and Lucchesi, Moseley met with Bender a couple of days later. He heard Bender's story about the three men. Bender informed him there would be an official announcement revealing the truth about flying saucers within the next 6 months. Moseley noted that Bender claimed to have been quite frightened, but that he himself found Bender's claims, quote, more amusing than terrifying, end quote. Moseley speculated about Bender's claim that he'd ceased his operations because of threats. He felt it may have been a cover story, and that Bender had more personal reasons for wanting to disband his organization. Moseley began his cross-country journey by driving to Washington, D.C. The first person he called was retired Marine Corps officer Major Donald E. Kehoe. Kehoe had made a big impact with his article, Flying Saucers Are Real, published in the January 1950 issue of True magazine. His book with the same title, put out that same year, was the first to be published on the subject. They talked on the phone, and Kehoe promised they would meet later that year when he had more time. Kehoe was informative, but Moseley got a sense that he was holding back because he viewed him as a rival author. When they met later, Moseley's feeling about Kehoe was confirmed. He saw him as a person who made much out of little in order to sell books. Moseley then traveled to California and talked with Frank Scully, author of the 1950 book, Behind the Flying Saucer. The book was written around an alleged flying saucer crash. He reported that a saucer and alien bodies had been recovered from Aztec, New Mexico. The case had been exposed in 1952 as a hoax perpetrated by two conmen, and Scully stuck by his story. The next meeting Moseley wrote about was extraordinary. He managed to interview Albert M. Chop and Edward J. Ruppelt together. Both had been involved in the 1952 flying saucer sightings over Washington, D.C. Available, Chop had been the Air Force's public information officer who handled UFO matters. Ruppelt was head of Project Blue Book from 1951 to 1953. The men discussed various cases and gave their opinions on Air Force UFO policy. Ruppelt asserted that there was no, quote, planned confusion, end quote. Chop added that there was instead, quote, pure stupidity, end quote. Chop believed that flying saucers were from outer space, while Ruppelt did not.
about replacing it, the technicians at Any Hour Services can help you keep your home comfortable all winter long. Call Any Hour Services or schedule online at anyhourservices.com. No one helps more homeowners than Any Hour Services. Any Hour Services can help with any size plumbing project around the house. All you have to do is call Any Hour Services or schedule an appointment at anyhourservices.com. Help with plumbing maintenance or plumbing repairs are closer than you think. Call Any Hour Services or visit anyhourservices.com.
What is Dax, are you?
Tracking all our cars on Carvana Value Tracker on all our devices? Yes, Kristen, yes I am.
Well, I've been looking for my phone for
Dax is going to see all
all of them.
Value surge, trucks up 3.9%.
That's a great offer.
I know. Is that
So,
track your car's value on Carvana Value Tracker?
All right, now, okay, so before we jump into this book, and I just want to go ahead and say that I was pleasantly surprised that you were writing something about true crime, because you are a very thorough writer. Your first two books that we discussed were fantastic, and actually I got a lot of great responses from having you on the show previously, so I'm glad to have you back on the show to talk about the True Crime Chronicles. But for those that didn't catch that show, Mike, can you take a moment to tell us a little bit about you and then why you decided to write about these true crimes?
Okay, a little bit, I'll sum up my background as quickly as possible. I was a police officer and detective in Los Angeles for 10 years, for the 70s and early 80s. Worked a number of assignments, patrol training officer, watch commander. Then I became a detective, and I worked vice, and I worked organized crime intelligence for 5 years, where primarily what I was doing is investigating the mafia, the traditional mafia back then, and other rising mafias like Israeli mafia, Russian mafia, and also corrupt politicians, which there was never a shortage of. But then I became a TV reporter and executive producer at ESPN. I hosted my own TV shows there. my background and two books that have recently been released, True Crime Chronicles. What happened was I was researching another book through some old archives, and I kept coming across fascinating stories of crime out of the 1800s, and some as far back as the 1600s. And some of them were people that, from the Wild West, that people hear about, like Butch Cassidy and Billy the Kid, Jesse James, the Earps, White Earp, and his brothers, and a lot of criminals that people have never heard about, but the crimes were unbelievable. They were serial killers that were, for a better term, far worse than what we've had in recent years, let's say the last 50 years in America. So the stories were absolutely fascinating as they were in the old newspapers. And so I thought, my goodness, these stories fascinate me. And at the time, those stories basically mesmerized the entire country because there's no radio or TV, it was just newspapers. And I thought, these would make a very interesting book. So I compiled dozens and dozens of these stories and put them in the book form. And along the line, I put my own commentary in because I was a detective and said, you know, this crime is basically the same as what happens today, except we call it something different. And people commit these crimes a little bit differently today than they did in the 1800s. So that's what got these two books going, and they've been very successful. And I've had a lot of comments from people and received emails that they said some of these stories of serial killers are far scarier than anything they've read in fiction novels because these are true, and these people were some really bad characters back then. And then it also enlightened a lot of people regarding the West at the time, the Wild West, like the Earp brothers, Wyatt Earp and so forth, that they weren't the pristine lawmen that we've seen in movies and heard in stories and seen written in books. They had an outlaw side to them. So that's the background for those two books.
Okay, so let me ask you something about the crimes, and I'm especially interested in hearing about the serial killers. Did you go as far as telling the reader about how these killers were caught, or did you just detail their crimes and so forth, and the victims?
Oh, no, they were, see, these are the original in-depth newspaper articles from them. And I have those books where the reporters at the time, completely different than today, is that they would immediately go to the scene, wherever it had to be, New York City or Texas or whatever, and the sheriff or the detectives would bring them right into the crime scene as they're investigating it, and bring them into interviews when they're interviewing or interrogating suspects. And so it tells you how they started, what the crime was, how the crime was committed, and so forth, the grisly details, and then ultimately what happened, where most of the serial killers, some of them got away. They just vanished. They never found them. Other times, they were hung. So it's just a fascinating story from beginning to end on a lot of these. Then I also put in, for a better term, what the newspapers called the killer stories. And they were, you'll see those in the newspaper today, short stories. They're maybe 100 words, 200, because they have the space. And so I put a lot of those in, not a lot, maybe 10, 12 in each book, that brings you a new insight to crimes at the time, the way people thought and what they did. And so some of them can be, to some people, rather funny. And in the one book I have talked about Jack the Ripper. But at the same time, when Jack the Ripper was going on in London, there was a Atlanta Ripper and a New York Ripper doing the same things in our country. But on the lighter side, there was also Jack the Haircutter, Jack the Kisser, Jack the Hugger, and Jack the Cutter. And so those guys were operating in various cities, mainly on the East Coast, but they were copycats too. As example, Jack the hair cutter. This guy would ride in a carriage in Washington, D.C. and New York and Boston. And if he saw a woman that had long braids or something, he would get out. So he would sneak up on them with a straight razor and cut their ponytail off or whatever they had, long hair. Then he would run away. And another one, Jack the Kisser, he would, same thing, he would see a woman or a girl walking the street, he would run up, grab them and kiss them. Then sometimes he would say a poem to them, then he would run away. And the police are always out looking for these guys staking out locations, but they never caught them. And Jack the Hugger, just what it says, he would do that. He would hug women. And then the one that's really pretty strange, beyond all these other two, is Jack the Cutter. And he was primarily in Washington, D.C. And during the 1860s and 1880s, women would wear long dresses that dragged on the ground. He thought that was horrible. So what he would do is jump out of his carriage with a pair of scissors, run over, grab the woman, and cut her dress about a foot up so it wouldn't drag on the ground. Then he would run away. So there's some really hideous stories about serial killers and other types of criminals, but then in volume 2, I put in these different Jack the Cutters and hair cutters and so forth to kind of lighten it up a little bit and also show that there's a different type of crime, a very bizarre crime at the time that had national attention.
Very good. I have to ask you about this because I'm really interested in how they actually went about investigating some of these crimes back then. So I know that you termed these killers serial killers, but I know that wasn't actually a term invented way back then. So are you just using that to just describe the fact that these people killed many people, or were thought to kill many people, and it was planned, or what did they call them back then?
They didn't. I never saw a true title that, like a serial killer, be called today. The only one that is close would be the Rippers, would be the Atlanta Ripper, the New York Ripper, which they were modeled and basically mentioned and given that title after the Whitechapel murders, Jack the Ripper in England, which I have stories about him too. And the rest of them were just the individuals' names, such as Belle Guinness. Belle Guinness, at the time, she had, for a better term, a small B&B out in the middle of nowhere. And when people would stop by, men primarily if they're traveling, she would invite them in, and for $1 or $2 they could spend the night. She would feed them, and then when they went to bed, she would chloroform them and kill them that way. And if they didn't die outright, she would cut their heads off. And
Wait a minute, she would decapitate them?
Yes, yeah. And then she would take the bodies out and either bury them in the garden, her garden, or she would feed them to her hogs.
At Smith's, an annual Boost membership just...
Holy moly, that is freaking loud. Why do the ads have to yell at you? Makes no sense.
finally learned what she was doing. She had killed, they were guessing, anywhere between 11 and 15 that were confirmed. And when the police were there at her farm one day doing the investigation, she'd already taken off somewhere. They thought, well, wait a minute, and they see a hog come out of the mud, the wallow, carrying a femur bone from somebody. And then the house ended up burning down shortly after that, and they went out there and they found 3 bodies of children, because she had 3 kids in the basement, burned to death, and then a body of a woman, but a headless body, about the same size as her, but she was known to decapitate people, and what they were thinking said, well, maybe somebody paid her back and that was her body, but then they said, we can't confirm it. She may have got another woman, approximately the same size, killed her kids, put them in the basement, burned the house down, and she took off.
So they never found out for sure that.
No, never confirmed that it was actually her. They couldn't confirm it. And then there was another group that were basically running like a little store and a B&B out in the middle of nowhere again, at a house called the Bender family. They called them the Bloody Benders. And it was a husband and his wife, their daughter and her husband. And what they would do, same thing, a man would stop by traveling, and he would come in, have something to eat, and they always put him in a chair with his back to the window, where he was right up against the window. The window would be open, and as the daughter kept him occupied in conversation, one of the men would come up behind him and hit him in the head with a hammer or an axe. And if that didn't kill him outright, they had a trap door beneath him. They would drop him through the trap door, where the oldest Bender woman, she was waiting for him, and she would cut their throats. Same thing if they had to decapitate them. And they killed quite a few, and they'd bury them out in their orchard. And finally, when law enforcement, everybody got on to them, they took off in different directions, and they were never captured.
And where did this? What state was this, Mike?
These are all down like in Kansas and that area around there at the time, and Missouri, so forth. And nobody knows to this day what happened to them, where they went.
Unreal. Wow.
Yeah. Then I don't know if you've heard about also having about Dr. Holmes. He built a castle, basically 1 city square block up in Chicago, and he had his own crematorium in there. He had vats of caustic chemicals and so forth in the basement, and it was just a massive house. And he would invite people to stay there, in many cases women, and he would kill them in a number of ways, and then he would either cremate the body in his own crematorium in the basement, or his most popular way, he had these huge vats, and he would dissolve the body in the vat, so the skeleton remained, and then he had a guy come in and articulate 3 of the skeletons, put them together and stand them up. So he was a real bizarre character. He killed, once again, they're not sure how many, but it could be as many as 30 people.
You know what? I never knew what happened to him. I mean, what kind of justice was given?
He was
to him?
eventually executed.
He was executed. Okay. Was he hung?
Yeah, and probably the most hideous criminals that everybody's emailed me about were the baby farmers, and they were primarily in England, and they ran for probably about a good 200 years, 1700s and 1800s. And I have stories of 3 of them in there, the actual stories of
Baby
what they
farmers.
would do.
Let me ask you something real quick before you get into that. Tell me a little bit about your research, and don't forget about the baby farmers. I don't want to hear.
Okay.
I want to hear about that. But can you tell us how you actually went through and got your stories? How'd you find them?
There are various archives in this country and in England that I went to, and most of them, all the stories I picked up, the vast majority are available online, and other ones I had to go through the National Archives and so forth. and Library of Congress. But there are archives, various newspaper archives in England and so forth, that you can go online, and if you know how to really navigate your way through everything, you can come up with these stories that they still have, and it's just phenomenal when you read them. And for instance, the archives in England, you can find loads of stories about the various kings and queens that were written at the time, back to the 1600s. And it would say Queen so-and-so's doing this today or whatever, or King so-and-so.